Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Korea Economic Institute. My name is Yang Kwon, and I'm the Director of Communications, and I'll be your moderator today. We and the Maureen and Mansfield Foundation are very happy to introduce Seth Berkman and introduce his new book, A Team of Their Own: How an International Sisterhood Made Olympic History. While it may be a little frustrating to see North Korean projectiles flying out to sea and some of Pyongyang's erratic and unpredictable reactions and negotiations, I think we can't forget where things stood in 2017. If you remember the days of fire and fury when the United States and North Korea appeared irreversibly pushing towards confrontation. But a shift came just as quickly as the escalation, especially after North Korea showed interest in jointly participating in the 2018 Winter Olympics in South Korea. At the heart of this major shift was an ice hockey team that was formed with athletes representing not only North and South Korea, but as you will find in the new book, A Team of Their Own, the team was truly pan-Korean, with players of Korean descent from Canada and the United States skating side by side. A lot was happening at Pyeongchang, both at a geopolitical level and at a human level, with players coming together for this unique opportunity. We're excited to have the author of the very first draft of this history speak with us on these developments. Seth Berkman has been a regular contributor to the New York Times since 2012, a graduate of Columbia University Journalism School. He has also had work published in The New Yorker and dozens of other local and national outlets. Born in Seoul and raised in New Jersey, Seth Berkman made his first trip back to South Korea during the 2018 Winter Olympics. Berkman met the joint Korea hockey team while on assignment for The New York Times. He is joined today by KAI President and CEO Ambassador Kathleen Stephens, who will serve as today's discussant. A career diplomat at the United States Foreign Service, she was U.S. Ambassador to the Republic of Korea from 2008 to 2011. Of course, her ambassadorship was not her first encounter with Korea. She served in rural Korea as a Peace Corps volunteer and trainer from 1975 to 1977. And she was in Korea from 1983 to 1989, first as a political officer at the U.S. Embassy in Seoul, reporting on Korea's domestic, political, and human rights scene, and later leading the U.S. consulate in Busan. If you are a subscriber to KBS, there's a new documentary out about Korea's democratization in the 1980s, featuring Ambassador Stephens' role in negotiating with Korean student protesters who occupied the U.S. Cultural Center. So please do check that out as well. From her post in Busan, she saw firsthand the democratic transition in 1987, and perhaps pertinent to this discussion, the 1988 Summer Olympics in Seoul and its political implications. Now with that, I will turn the mic to the author, Seth.
Thank you everyone for coming out today. So as was mentioned earlier before, this book started as a newspaper article I was writing. In late 2016, discussing with my editor, we just kind of came up with the idea of how South Korea going to field hockey teams for the Winter Olympics. In 2011, South Korea was awarded the bid to host the 2018 games, and ice hockey has always been a centerpiece event for the Winter Olympics. It's one of the marquee events every 4 years, but at the time, only about 200 women were registered as ice hockey players in South Korea, when countries like Sweden, Canada, the US have thousands upon thousands of players to draw from. And so what we discovered was that South Korea was reaching out to players of Korean American descent, Korean Canadian descent, and offering them citizenship essentially, and asking them, would you like to represent South Korea in the Olympic Games coming up? And when these players first received these emails or Facebook messages, they thought they were spam or they were being pranked. The messages had broken English and random Korean symbols, and they just didn't think that they were real. The first one that kind of became verified was one of the players, Danelle Im, who's from Toronto. She had an uncle who lived in Seoul, and so the uncle kind of did some investigating and reached out to the Korea Ice Hockey Association, who told him, yes, this is a real thing. And 2 weeks later, Danelle was in Seoul training with the team. That kind of gives you a little bit of the background of what they were called the quote-unquote import players, the Korean Canadians, Korean Americans, but this team also had about 15, 16 South Korean nationals. And one of the interesting things, and one of the things I really picked up on immediately that I thought was unique, was half of the South Korean national players were teenagers, essentially. They were 14, 15, 16-year-old girls who had been playing hockey since they were 7, 8, 9 years old. And one of the reasons were, yes, they were skilled players, but also since there weren't many hockey players in South Korea, they had a relatively easy route compared to maybe other nations into joining the national team. And then, of course, later on, you had the component of the North Korean players being added, which made this truly an international team for the Olympics. Ms. Stephens, do you have any points or questions? Or
Oh,
yeah.
well, I was going to actually. Sure, I'll intervene anytime you want, but I did read the proof of the book. I guess this is over the last few days, and it is a really interesting and compelling read. But one thing that surprised me, you've already touched on, because I knew that this was a book, the attention came to this because of the unified team at the Pyeongchang Olympics, and I know we're going to get to that. But the first half of the book really is about the formation of this team, and I actually do have a couple of questions just about, if you like, women's sports in Korea, because I think there's a kind of a women's sports aspect. Mm-hmm. There's a sort of a sports diplomacy aspect, and there's kind of the Korean diaspora aspect, and you really talk a lot about that in the book. But with respect to ice hockey, as you mentioned, there were these young teenagers, these Korean young girls, young women who started playing ice hockey. Can you talk a little bit about why ice hockey, even came to attention? Was it because of the Olympics? I'm thinking, back in my history in Korea, in the 1980s, I lived in Korea, as Young mentioned. And at that time, this may be unimaginable to those of you who were born in the 1980s or afterwards, Korean women did not play golf. And when I went to the golf course, I play golf very badly, there was no women's restroom. The only women on the Korean golf course were the caddies, who were very, very good at giving advice about where to hit, but they were not permitted, essentially. It wasn't a law, but they just weren't permitted to play. So it was really a surprise to me that within the course of 2 decades, Korean women came to dominate not just, Asian golf, but world golf. Figure skating would be a similar story. But so what about ice hockey? How did that kind of emerge? And maybe I'm getting ahead of myself, but do you see a future for Korean women's ice hockey?
So the story of ice hockey in Korea kind of begins for the women's team around 1998. The upcoming Asian Games were coming up in about a year, and so Korea wanted to field a women's ice hockey team for the event. And so they basically created their first team from athletes that they knew that were former figure skaters or speed skaters. None of them had really played hockey before. So the first actual national team was this really ragtag bunch of players. And they actually made a movie about it in South Korea a couple years ago. It was called Runoff. It's also called Takeoff 2, but it's not actually the sequel of Takeoff 1. It's just called Takeoff 2, but it's also called Runoff. But that movie chronicles the early South Korean women's national teams and shows their backgrounds from these different sports and how they were just basically thrown together on the ice. One of the players on the Olympic team, Shin So-jung, who was the starting goaltender, she joined the national team when she was about 9 years old. So-jung, by the time the Olympics came, she was in her 20s, so she had been on the team for about 14, 15 years. And so by the time you get to the core of what the Olympic team was, you had players like So-jung, who basically had been on the national team for half of their life. For those early women's hockey teams in South Korea, the conditions were not good. So all the national teams trained at the Taering facility, which is on the outskirts of Seoul, kind of, and the women's hockey team was relegated to training at 10, 11 p.m. at night. The prime ice times were either given towards the men's hockey team or speed skaters. Even in the other few ice rinks that there are around Seoul, all the prime training time was given to speed skating just because of what a marquee sport it was. And so if you wanted to play hockey, the only chances you had to practice or skate were very late at night. But it even went further with that, with the women's hockey team, and kind of the obstacles that they faced. The players told me, everyone told me these stories, how when they first joined, and this is around mid-2000s, early 2000s, they weren't even allowed to eat in the cafeteria at Terring. All the other national teams had their meals, breakfast, lunch, dinner in the facility. They lived and slept there. All the women's hockey players commuted from Seoul or even as far as away as 2-3 hours away just to go there for practice. And they always remembered having to sit outside the cafeteria, eating their lunch or their dinner while all the other athletes ate inside. For a women's hockey player, there was a small stipend provided. By the time a few years before the Olympics, it had reached a limit of about $50 per day. But there was a caveat to that where you only earn that stipend if you practice 15 days each month, so half of the month. If you came in 1 day short, 14 days, you didn't earn anything for that month. And when these South Korean nationals first joined the team 10 years earlier, they estimated they were making about $12, $13 a day with the same kind of caveat where they had to reach a certain limit to make any kind or else they weren't paid for that month. And so that made it really difficult for them for at least the older players to maintain careers and maintain this interest in hockey while trying to earn money. A lot of them worked part-time jobs in convenience stores or somewhere like Daiso or as a waitress where they could maybe scrap together part-time work and still focus on hockey. But in terms of making any kind of career, that just seemed impossible. And that caused also a lot of conflict with their families, naturally. One of the players was amazing pianist. I had actually got the privilege of listening to her play. She was from what I can gather, a pretty esteemed concert pianist in South Korea. She went to all the top schools growing up, and then Yonsei, she studied in their music program and gave all these recitals, but she loved hockey. And so there came a point where she wanted to devote her career to hockey, but her parents were very against it. And so one day she's going to college classes to study, and she passes by a skating rink, and she just wants to be on the ice. She doesn't want to go to piano lessons. And so she goes into the shop, the kind of equipment store that's right next to the rink, and she purchases a pair of ice skates. She's determined to get back into ice hockey and make this her career. When she comes home, she makes sure to rip up the receipt so her mom won't find it. And then later that night, as she was sleeping, her mother wakes her up. She had found the receipt and taped together the shreds that she had found in the garbage and confronted her, and why did you buy the ice skates? And so that was what a lot of the players even had to convince friends, family. A lot of them didn't even know what ice hockey was. And so those were the kind of obstacles that they were up against, just deciding to devote their lives to this really what seemed like a niche sport. And no one could understand what the purpose was. And then obviously a few years later when the Olympics came around, it seemed like they were going to finally get this opportunity to prove their worth.
Right. So you have all these wonderful vignettes that say so much about, Korean determination and perseverance and sometimes family expectations and how they come in conflict. You also have some really interesting observations on how, ice hockey is not considered a very feminine sport. And as Kim Yuna and Korean women going into figure skating became kind of the epitome of a modern Korean womanhood, the notion of being an ice hockey player was somehow at odds with that. So here you have this kind of scrappy group of young women who kind of against a lot of maybe societal prejudice and financial difficulties and even family opposition start to form this team, hope to get into the Olympics. And then you're in a situation where, say, not unlike some other sports, but where they start to bring in the imports, right? Yeah. They start going out and looking for people with some kind of Korean connection, whether they were adopted abroad or have some Korean parentage, with family who'd immigrated from Korea, and bringing these players in. And a coach as well, I think. So could you say a word, and we will get to the North Korea part, but this really is a setting for it. That was the first sort of unified team, if you like, in a way. And,
right.
And could you say how that kind of played out?
Yeah, and you mentioned Kim Yuna, and so many players on the team would tell me these stories about their parents when they learned that they were ice skating. They thought they were going to do figure skating, or they wanted them to do figure skating. I remember one player, Lee Kyu-sun, who was the oldest player on the team. Her mom would always complain to her of having to wash her hockey gear. She would say, why can't I be washing, these beautiful skirts or dresses like Kim Yuna? I have to wash these blood-stained hockey jerseys and equipment. But yeah, so you did have this small dedicated core of players in South Korea, but I think even they knew, once they knew the Olympics were coming in 2018, that they weren't yet at a level where they could compete with the other countries. And so how the imports were first found, I interviewed this member of the Korea Ice Hockey Association, which is the governing body for ice hockey in South Korea, similar to Hockey Canada or USA Hockey here. And so when they go on this search for new players, basically how it happened was one day this one worker goes online and basically starts Googling or using Naver and looks up college hockey rosters for Canadian teams and American teams. So he looks at every American or Canadian college that has a women's hockey team and opens up their roster. And he's looking for names that sound Korean, or if they happen to have pictures on the website, if they look Korean, he's marking down their
It's very
name
scientific, very
to email them. And he even told me the first few players he reached out to were actually Chinese. And so he didn't think he was going to get in contact with anyone until he met Danelle, the one player who had the uncle, and that kind of opened up the gates. And so one of the things that really interested me was when these import players are contacted, a lot of them, there was one player who was adopted, there were other players who grew up in mixed race families, but just about all of them grew up with not this sense of not feeling Korean. Their identity was something that they very much struggled with. There was one player, Randy Griffin, who was an import player from North Carolina, who was half white, half Korean. She told me the story about it. She remembers very vividly. There was one Korean restaurant where she grew up in North Carolina, and her mother always wanted to take her children. Randy had a brother and a sister, so her 3 children to this Korean restaurant. And the one time they went, Randy's mother, who was Korean, could hear the waitstaff talking about her children in Korean. So she lifted them up from the table and kind of ran them out. And that always stuck with Randy and kind of always, I don't know if you would say confused her, but gave her these more complicated feelings, I guess, of who she is being half Korean living in the U.S., but also how she felt around other Koreans living here as well. So these import players definitely had these, deep, complicated, evolving feelings of just who they were, and then to be presented with this opportunity to not only play in the Olympics but represent South Korea. It was something that some of them really grasped onto right away, but something a lot of them had fears and worries about. Randy, the one player I just mentioned, she took over a year before she accepted the offer. She had various reasons why, but a main reason was she thought she might be taking away a spot from a Korean girl who she thought was more deserving, who had grown up living in South Korea playing hockey, and who Randy felt deserved a spot more than she would, and situations like that would come up later on. But when by the time the Olympic roster was made, there were 6 import players who were on the team. A couple other girls did come over and try out, and it didn't work out for them. They weren't maybe as skilled, or a lot of them were also in college at times, so some players decided they couldn't take a year and a half off, 2 years to train for the team. But the final Olympic roster did have 6 import players, and when they first came, it wasn't all rosy for them. There were walls, barriers that had to be broken down. The first 2 players were Danelle and another player, Caroline Park. And even they have a very interesting background story. So when Danelle is asked to come join the Korean hockey team, they also mentioned to her, by the way, do you happen to know by chance any other Koreans in Canada who play hockey? And it just so happened that a couple years earlier, Danelle's father was walking the family dog. They live in the suburbs of Toronto, and he spots a Korean woman wearing a women's ice hockey jacket that says Princeton Ice Hockey, and so he immediately goes over and starts talking to her, and so it turns out that's Caroline's mom. They live basically 3 minutes apart on the same street and had never seen each other before except for that day. But then they found out that they played hockey together. And so Danelle and Caroline were the first 2 players to go there. And so Caroline did speak a little bit of Korean. She grew up being somewhat fluent. Danelle did not at all. But when they enter the locker room and meet the team for the first time, all the South Korean national girls, they're whispering and mumbling. And some of them are saying somewhat mean things towards the 2 new imports, until Caroline finally pipes up and says, I can understand what you're saying, And so the players immediately kind of, stop in a way. But over time, what the South Korean players did get to notice was these players can be helpful. They realized how skilled they were. They realized that they brought a certain Western style of play that the South Koreans weren't used to, but knew that they needed to compete with the best teams in the world. And so when every import came, there was an initial cold period. It's like, oh, it's another import. And then the South Korean players started to worry, is my spot in jeopardy? Might I lose my spot to this new coming player? But then they saw how much they really did help the team and could make them better. So over time, they were accepted into the dynamic. And I think what really the center and the core of the book to me is, and what really made this a team and what really makes this story so unique is, over time, as the imports are integrated into the team dynamic, there really becomes this give and take between the two sides of the South Korean national players and the imports. And what I mean by that is, as I had mentioned earlier, the import players had this struggle of identity, this search for belonging that they had experienced all their lives, but now they're living in South Korea among South Korean women who not only can give them a glimpse into maybe what their life could have been like in South Korea, but also just teaching them about the culture and the history. And so finally they're getting this missing chunk of their lives in terms of just feeling more Korean than before. And then the other aspect of that is, since so many of the girls on the team were so young teenagers, and I'm sure we all knew kind of the conflicts or the thoughts or how we handled emotions when we were 14, 15, 16 years old, the South Korean girls are going through all that evolution as young women. And so a lot of them had issues, or I shouldn't even say issues, but they battled things like depression, but they never talked to that about other classmates or even players on the team, just because it's something you don't talk about openly very much in South Korea. There were other players on the team who had questions about sexuality and topics like that, and the same kind of thing. It was something that they would never discuss openly with their colleagues at school or even teammates. But to the import players, these were questions and topics that were totally normal to them in a way. They had no problem discussing feelings like depression or how players might feel in certain situations with the South Korean players. And it got to a point where they would have in their dorm rooms almost like these Q&A sessions where the South Koreans would just kind of pepper them with questions of, oh, what about this or this situation, or have you ever felt this way? And so that give and take between the two sides really brought the imports and the South Korean players closer. And then eventually the North Korea dynamic comes in and throws everything awry, I guess, in a way.
Right. So what really surprised me again about this book and this story is that even before the North Korean dynamic, there is this extraordinary story of this team coming together with so many fascinating strands to it, and even a movie about it in South Korea. But now to go up to the North Korean dynamic coming in, maybe you can kind of walk us through that a bit. I mean, one thing again that surprised me, a lot of spoiler alerts here. I guess this talk is one big spoiler alert. Is that. The notion that there might be a unified team and that it might be a unified North-South team in the Pyeongchang Olympics and that it might be the women's hockey team was actually an idea that came quite early. I mean, even before the events of the late 2017. But so if you could describe that a little bit, and then of course I think run us then kind of through the dramatic developments that led to the unified team.
Yeah. So. A lot of people remember January 2018, Kim Jong-un goes on North Korean state television and gives his New Year speech where he mentions for the first time he would like North Korean athletes to participate in the upcoming Olympics, which by then are only a month away. But actually before that, in the summer of 2017, when Minister Do had just been named the new Minister for Culture, Sports, and Tourism in South Korea, I believe it was just kind of a very informal press conference or speaking with reporters, and he almost randomly brought up the idea of, it would be nice if in the upcoming Winter Olympic Games next year, if we could form a unified team in ice hockey, perhaps. And that was the first that anyone had really heard about this idea. The players on the team had never heard about it. Workers at KIHA, the Korea Ice Hockey Association, had never heard this idea, but all of a sudden it just kind of took off. Within days, President Moon was backing the idea. Thomas Bach, who's the president of the International Olympic Committee, he threw his support behind it, and it became somewhat of a big story in the South Korean news cycle. And so the players were then being bombarded with these questions of, oh, do you think you'll be playing with North Koreans in the Olympics? What would that be like? What are your feelings and opinions? And they did not know how to confront that. They had never been approached with this before. It just really randomly seemed to come out of the blue. But they became very defensive about it. They were being told at the time to, not ignite any flames or say anything too derogatory, but the players were really incensed, and a lot of that stems from, just how they had been treated for a decade plus before. They always recognized that they were basically the lowest level of the totem pole when it came to South Korean sports, not only being ice hockey, which is not a very popular sport, but being female athletes in South Korea. And so there was that resentment. Then there was the idea of, okay, we were able to accept these import players, but now you're also going to throw another whole dynamic into the team when it originally just started as the South Korean women's hockey team. So you had these players battling all these feelings and, now being asked about it in all the newspapers and TV stations. Eventually, though, it just kind of died away. Within a few weeks, it didn't become a story. And one thing that I thought was, I don't know if you'd say it was kind of funny, but it was almost like the import players, I guess, were worried as well at the time. So they would ask the South Korean players, hey, is this going to actually happen? And a lot of the South Korean players told them, no, it's North Korea. Anything that they says isn't going to happen. This is what we've been dealing with our entire lives, basically. There's always this bluster or, these ideas that come about, and then just nothing materializes. Little did they know, though, 6 months later, after Kim Jong-un gives his speech, that's when things really start kicking into high gear. At the time, Kim Jong-un didn't specifically say, we would like to send North Korean hockey players to the Olympics. It was just North Korean athletes. But when people hear this, especially people in South Korea, immediately their minds kind of shift back to 6 months earlier when the women's hockey team was brought about. And so at this time, the South Korean team is in Minnesota training. Every few months, they would come to Minnesota and hold training camps, essentially. They would play college teams in the Midwest, and that's how they were preparing for the Olympics, because there just was no one else to play in South Korea. There are no other women's teams they could compete against. And so I was with the team in Minnesota in January 2018, and there was worry. You would see them at lunch or, in their leisure time just kind of asking each other, do you think this is going to happen? But to their credit, it didn't overtake the team. It didn't ruin anything in terms of chemistry or dynamic at the time. They were so focused on the Olympics and getting accomplishing the task at hand that they almost didn't have time in a way to worry about North Korea. So, and also they had been told by Kia that if this was going to happen, we will let you know in advance. And so they hadn't heard anything yet from, the governing body that this unified team would come to fruition.
But this is January 2018.
This is January 2018.
And the Olympics
are in weeks. And the team departs around January 18th or 19th. Okay. They head back to South Korea, and so the import players actually had a couple days. They could stay behind with their families, fly off to where they lived, and spend 2-3 days with their families before they went back to Korea. So the morning the team departs, later that day, I have breakfast or lunch with the coach. And so the coach, Sarah Murray, she's Canadian American. She was born in Canada, raised in the US, and played women's hockey here. She won national championships in college, was a very well-known women's hockey player, and she was hired eventually as the coach of the team. And so as the team sent off, I'm talking with her later that day, and I bring up the North Korea topic, and the same kind of thing. She just was like, I haven't heard anything from KIHA. We're just going about it as, until we hear that, we're going to carry on as just our team.
KIHA is the
Korea Ice Hockey Association, KIAJ. And so the team flies back, and while they're in the air heading back to South Korea, that's when the decision is made to make this joint unified hockey team. So when they land in Incheon, they're at baggage claim, basically waiting for their baggage, and so they turn on their phones finally and are looking, and that's how they find out. That's how they got the news that the unified team was going to happen. Actually, the news had broke a bit earlier. I guess maybe journalists were tipped off, and so when they exit customs and get to exit the airport, there are journalists waiting there and sticking microphones and asking them questions. How do they feel about this? And so suddenly, 2-3 weeks before the Olympic Games, now they're just thrust into this international spotlight, this geopolitical experiment that has never been seen on this kind of stage before. And you have these girls, half of them 15, 16-year-old, but all of them just, never recognized in any kind of way, suddenly thrown into the spotlight.
Yeah, wow. Yeah, I mean, it is, so as far as you were able to find out, there was never any kind of discussion or conversation about a unified team before Minister Doe even floated it earlier, and later, it seems kind of remarkable there was never any communication with the team.
Right. I have read interviews or seen interviews with members from the IOC who said that this was something that they had thought about years and years before, but it seemed when everything came together to be very rushed, and the way it played out just to seem very last minute. For example, no one knew how many players were going to come. Once the South Koreans learned, okay, the North Korean players are coming, they thought maybe it'll be 3-4 players. It ended up being 12 North Korean players. So you went from a roster of having 23 to 35. And then the IOC also made this special mandate where they demanded that 3 North Korean players had to dress for every game. So that normally on the Olympic roster there would be 23 players, 22 players would dress. So that meant only 1 South Korean player each game wouldn't be active in essence. But now since you had 3 North Korean players being told that they had to dress, there were now 4 South Koreans that even though they were on the roster wouldn't be playing. And what kind of made that even more sadder for a lot of the players was when the team went to Minnesota for their training camp, they had 24 players on the roster. So they knew coming out of Minnesota, 1 player was going to be cut off the Olympic team. And the 1 player, Lee Min-ji, she had been on the team for over a dozen years, I believe. The team was everything to her, and then she was the final cut. And what made it even sadder was a couple days before the Olympics, the South Korean team, now called the Unified Team, had an exhibition match, and in that match, one of the South Korean players got hurt. She fractured her ankle, I believe, and so she couldn't play in the Olympics. And normally that spot, Minji would have been called up to take her spot, but now since the North Koreans had been added, there was no need to bring Minji on the team because you had 12 North Korean players there automatically. And so that's at the point when we're reaching the Olympics, and now the unified team is here.
Right, so just remind us a little bit of the timeline. And of course, I think this is where all of us became somewhat aware of all this,
Right.
Including, you may want to talk about the fact that there was, considerable public controversy in South Korea,
Right.
which, and kind of how that came about. But also, I'm sure there's some hockey fans here. They didn't have very long to practice together. So maybe kind of run through that timeline and remind us how compressed this all is within just a few,
Right.
not even a few weeks.
So by this time, the South Korean team is based at a training facility in Jincheon, outside of Seoul. So there was a new Olympic facility built a couple months before the 2018 games, so everyone had moved out of Taering, and now they were at Jincheon. And so the North Koreans arrived at Jincheon January 24th or January 25th, I believe, and it's this huge event covered by all the media. The way a lot of players described it to me, and then even seeing footage from KBS, SBS, and the stations in South Korea, there were actually helicopters following the bus of North Koreans as they crossed the border and as they made their way to Jincheon. It almost resembled, I don't know if many of you remember, but like when O.J. Simpson was being chased in his white Bronco, that's what it looked like, because you had the helicopter from above just trailing this car, driving for hours and hours on end. And so they finally arrive, and the South Korean players are told to stand outside with bouquets of flowers. It would be this big event, this big photograph that the IOC and the Korean government wanted to send out to the world when these two sides first meet. And the South Korean players are not happy. They don't want to be there. They don't want to be a part of this. They weren't almost everyone wasn't in favor of it. They thought it was very unfair. They didn't want to be put into this position. There was only maybe one player who was maybe a little interested or giddy about it. Her name is Grace Lee. She was an import player. She was 18 years old or so at the time, so still in high school. And she thought it was just the coolest thing ever that she was going to meet people from North Korea. And so Grace was actually a bit happy about it, but everyone else was pretty upset about the situation. So they're standing out there, it's freezing cold, they're made to hold these flowers so they can't even put their hands in their pockets. And then the North Korean delegation arrives, and so the North Koreans get off the bus, and you have all the South Koreans standing on one side and the North Koreans on the other, and for a minute it almost looks like something from like West Side Story, where they're just gonna converge and clash, and who knows. But eventually one of the South Korean players walks over and hands their flowers, and they meet and greet and take a picture together. And so this is just 2 weeks essentially before the Olympic Games start. And so after all the pictures are taken, the South Korean players are like, okay, we need to get down to business here. We need to integrate you into our team, teach you everything you need to know, because their goal here isn't to make any kind of political statement. The South Koreans want to win a game at the Olympics. This is what they've wanted their entire lives. And so the team heads into Jincheon and has their first meetings, their first sessions together, but almost immediately a big problem arises, and the South Koreans learn that the North Koreans essentially don't speak the same hockey language as they do. Their terminology, just their cadence and everything was very much different. For example, if a South Korean player would say, "Pass me the puck," a North Korean player would say, "Contact me." But when you're on the ice, the South Korean player didn't understand what she means when she's saying "contact me." You would just say "pass." And so what they did was they made a dictionary of about 70 or 80 terms of a North Korean term, a South Korean term, and then the English term, so everyone could at least in some way kind of get on the same page of how they would communicate on the ice. Another reason why a lot of the South Korean players were upset about this unified team happening was they knew that the North Koreans weren't of as good a skill level as they were. One player even said to me after the Olympics, when they made the unified team happen and the North Koreans came, we essentially knew any chance we had of winning was gone. They had played a couple times before the Olympics and Games, and South Korea easily beat them, and so they knew that they weren't, even though you had 12 new players coming over, they were not going to help in any kind of way, but they did their best to try to acclimate them as best they could on the ice. But then even off the ice, problems started to arise, just in terms of it was very hard to make any kind of unique connections or have even just what seemed like genuine conversations with the North Korean players. Very early on, when they would meet at the cafeteria, by this time the South Koreans were allowed in the cafeteria to eat at the training facility, but they would just try to drum up any kind of casual talk with the North Koreans, and a North Korean player would respond with something, "Oh yes, this is all thanks to the great leader." They would answer every question that way, thanking Kim Jong-un. It could be for their hockey equipment or what they were wearing. One of the stories that I kind of like was early on, so they're at the cafeteria, and the North Koreans bring up the topic of ice cream. And so the South Koreans are like, "Okay, we'll play along." And the North Korean player asks, "Do you like ice cream? In Pyongyang, we have ice cream shops that have 3 different flavors." And one of the South Korean player goes, "Man, if we ever take her to Baskin-Robbins, she's going to defect right away." But that kind of shows you just had this kind of communication that you wanted to happen, but these barriers that were not allowing it. I think one of the things that maybe eased that or maybe changed things in a way was, so all the national athletes, Olympic athletes, are at Jincheon at this time, preparing for the Olympics. So you have skiers, speed skaters, snowboarders, etc. So it's full of people, and everyone there is told, don't take pictures of the North Koreans, don't take video of them. But it's kind of hard to, I guess, not to. But you would have, players, every time they would enter a room or a public space, people would just pull out their phones and start gawking and filming them, and it almost resembled just like you would go to a zoo and see animals on display, and that's how it felt. And that's how it felt for the South Koreans being with the North Koreans, and seeing them viewed in that way. A lot of players felt empathetic and did not like to see them treated in that kind of light. And in a way, I think it was something that they were familiar with, just being in that position and feeling of being looked down upon or being treated as less than. So that was something that they could relate to. And over time, early on, there were a lot of Olympic officials, even government officials, even alleged North Korean spies watching over the athletes in Jincheon. But as, players were able to get time on their own, more genuine kind of bonds were created. One of my favorite stories from kind of chronicling the team was one of the import players, Marissa Brandt. Marissa's adopted from Minnesota. She grew up in Minnesota, adopted from South Korea, and Marissa is one of the most genuinely kind, sweethearted people you can meet. And so she took in some of the North Korean players. Marissa doesn't speak Korean, but she would always be open, wave them over to come sit by her, things like that. And so there was one player every day, she would come over to Marissa and basically signal to her that she wanted to see her cell phone. And Marissa could tell that the North Korean girl probably never even saw or had used a cell phone before, just the way she handled it, and couldn't, access the screen or anything on it. But she would communicate to Marissa that she would want to see her album of photos. And so every day Marissa would bring up her photo album, and she would notice the North Korean player just for 10-15 minutes, almost like in a trance, just stare at the photos of Marissa with her friends and Marissa with her family. Mm-hmm. And she would always wonder, what's she thinking in that moment? Is she wondering, is she thinking about me, or is she kind of picturing herself in this moment? Is she thinking about what her life could be like if she didn't live in North Korea? And so that was something that always stuck out with Marissa, just kind of, I can't communicate with this girl, but I can sense, what she's feeling or what she's thinking in a way.
I'm thinking when I first went to South Korea in the 1970s and was living in the Korean countryside, didn't speak much Korean. I found any Korean I met, there were no cell phones in those days, the first thing they would do if you got into especially if you visited their home or something, is pull out their photo books and you go through them together. It was like how you established a human connection. Yeah. Much more. Anyway, so the Olympics start. Again, I know we want to get to a discussion, and you have to read the book to get all the details. But I wanted to tell this story. You may have others you want to tell of the two players who were given the assignment. This is outside of hockey. Of carrying the Olympic torch together. Yeah. I thought that was very interesting.
Yeah. And
in terms of some of the expectations of them outside of the hockey ring.
Right. If you don't mind, I'll read an excerpt from that part. So this is the opening ceremony of the games. Obviously, probably the moment that everyone remembers or thinks about is when the Olympic torch is lit. And so in the opening ceremony for the 2018 games, they had one player from North Korea, one player from South Korea, bring the Olympic torch to the top of the stadium. So I'll read a short excerpt about that moment just to kind of describe the scene. On February 9th, the unified team slid on matching outfits, long white jackets, navy blue wool hats, black tracksuits, and black and red sneakers, then boarded buses to Pyeongchang for the opening ceremony of the 2018 Winter Olympics. For the South Korean players, despite the recent government interference that thrust them into a political showcase, the night still represented the culmination of years of sacrifice. Bouncing around like kids on a sugar rush, 17-year-old Soo-yeon Ohm and 30-year-old Han Soo-jin cracked jokes with colleagues from North Korea and took turns in having them try on novelty plastic sunglasses shaped like the Olympic rings. Before the first team of Olympic athletes from North and South Korea was revealed to the world, some players remembered the cold dinners they ate outside Taering when they weren't allowed to dine inside, and the cursing outbursts from older teammates annoyed by their presence. Choi Ji-yeon and Shin So-jung thought about their fathers, who always supported their rare interest in hockey, and whom they hoped were watching from a celestial seat in the sky. Others were reminded of Lee Min-ji, giving half of her life to the team yet not being there, a victim of cruel circumstance. Making Minji's absence even more painful was that during the Sweden exhibition game, forward Lee Eun-ji tore a ligament in her ankle, which forced her to miss the Olympics. Before the merger, Eun-ji's spot would have gone to Minji. They also were thinking of Lee Kyu-sun, who that morning had to relinquish her place in the opening ceremony to a South Korean Olympic official who wanted to insert himself into the historic moment. Finally, the public address announcer called on the athletes from Korea, and Coach Park Chol-ho from North Korea suggested to Coach Sarah Murray that they hold hands in a sign of unity. During the opening ceremony's Parade of Nations, tradition dictates that the host country marches into the stadium last. Carrying the unified Korean flag were two athletes, one from each side of the peninsula, including 22-year-old women's hockey player Hwang Jung-geum from North Korea. As Chung-geum swung the majestic giant flag from side to side, Caroline Park threw her arm around Sojung, while Randy Griffin, a Korean-American from Apex, North Carolina, walked nearby Cho Jang-hui, her teammate from Chongjin, North Korea. Looking into an expanse of fluorescent pink, purple, and blue lights flashing around the stadium, Choi Yu-jung and Lee Yeon-jung waved to no one in particular, soaking in the adulation that resonated through the frigid mountain air. As the delegation completed their lap, in their private box seats, South Korean President Moon Jae-in and his wife waved at the players, and then shook hands with Kim Yo-jung, the sister of Kim Jong-un. Another North Korean dignitary in the section was 90-year-old Kim Young-nam, the second most powerful person in his country. After bickering with the South for nearly 70 years, he wiped away tears watching women's hockey players from both sides of the peninsula march as one team. Stunned by the sight of 35,000 fans in awe of her team's presence, Grace Lee, whose feet had been punished by years of surgeries, felt as if she was floating. "It's a feeling words can never express," Grace said. "Being the host country and seeing thousands of people supporting you, it's something special and something that I'll never forget. I fell in love with Korea right then and there." Next, it was time for the Olympic torch to enter the stadium. First, the flame passed through a cavalry of several famous South Korean professional athletes before being handed off to two relative unknowns representing something worth more than their predecessors' millions of winnings ever could. The previous night, Park Jong-ga was dumbfounded when she was informed by Olympic officials that she was needed in Pyeongchang upon special request. She wolfed down her dinner and waited for Soo-yeon, who also had been invited to attend this top-secret meeting. Jong-ga waited for an hour, unaware that Soo-yeon did not receive clearance from her handlers to leave the North Korean party. Soo-yeon had to inform Coach Park, who then had to inform a government official to get proper approval. By the time the order made its way through the bureaucratic chain of command, it was too late and the messengers in Pyeongchang canceled the appointment. The next morning, Jong-ga and Soo-yeon were sent a video, a rehearsal of two athletes climbing to the top of the Olympic Stadium with the Olympic torch, which since ancient Greece represented honor, divinity, and inspiration. Every other aspect of the ceremony had been rehearsed hundreds of times. Jong-ga and Soo-yeon had one shot to get it right. Hours later, wearing matching gold and white jumpsuits, they stood at the bottom of a staircase that was designed to only hold one person and was intentionally created to form a slope that curved like a tidal wave to signify the challenging hardships Olympic athletes must conquer. With Jong-ga wearing an earpiece to receive directions on when to begin their ascent, the lights dimmed and a spotlight shone on their backs, creating the sense that they were the only two people in the stadium. Soo-yeon turned to Jong-ga on her left, smiled and whispered, "Let's do a good job." The two 21-year-olds then put one hand each on the torch and began their voyage to pursue 7 decades of pain caused by the separation of North and South Korea, 7 decades that cemented in the minds of everyone watching that this was not possible. Jogging up the first of 120 steps, Soo-yeon started out slightly ahead, forcing Jong-ga to catch up from behind. This was a bit nerve-wracking, as actually traipsing up the staircase proved much more difficult than Jong-ga imagined. "As soon as I started going up, it was even steeper and higher," Jong-ga said. "I was scared that I would fall. It was tiring as well. There were so many steps." Jong-ga and Soo-yeon finally achieved harmony as a captivated audience watched their trek to the cauldron. Awaiting them at the summit was Kim Yoo-na, the South Korean national icon royally outfitted in a sparkling white dress. Understanding the gravitas of the moment, Jong-ga tried to stay emotionless, but couldn't hide her grin the closer she neared her childhood idol. Finally, they reached the apex of their journey and turned and waved to an audience full of teary eyes. Jong-ga and Soo-yeon calmly walked over to Kim Yoo-na and she took the torch the hockey players had worked so ardently to bring to the uppermost reaches of the stadium and finally lit the cauldron, illuminating what many around the world, including the Pope, came to regard as the Peace Games. I wish future generations will remember this day and record this day as a special day of the Winter Olympic Games when peace began, President Moon proclaimed. On a freezing night in the mountains of South Korea, just 50 miles from the Korean demilitarized zone, 35 young women warmed the hearts of millions of viewers who no longer saw Korea as two separate countries. The Korean peninsula that Jongga and Sunyan represented is only about the size of Utah in square mileage, but the symbolism that they projected of this idea of one Korea resonated through the most embittered souls. Jongga and Sunyan overcame yet another obstacle in their lives, a journey that only could have been completed together. Months later, sitting in a Starbucks in Seoul, Jongga recounted that memorable night when two young Koreans from the most disparate of backgrounds, seemingly sharing only a common love of hockey, found out that they were not so different after all. Being able to carry the torch was a significant event on its own, a fascinating experience and an honor, Jongga said. But the fact that I did it with a North Korean player who I'm on the unified team with made it even more special to me. Jongga's teammates actually did not see the torch climb until the next morning. After the unified team completed their lap around the stadium, the South Koreans headed directly to their buses since their first game was the following day, information somehow not transmitted to Jongga. Following the conclusion of the opening ceremony, she hugged Soo-young goodbye, then looked for the rest of her colleagues. A bit scared, not unlike how she used to walk alone at home late at night from tearing, Jongga worried about how she would get back to Gangneung. The North Korean players had stayed behind to wait for Soo-yeon and spotted Jongga circling around looking lost. Naturally, they invited Jongga on their bus and rode back home together.
Well, that's a lovely passage, and that does give you a sense of just the richness of detail that characterizes this whole book. And I wanted to turn to a discussion, and we will, but I realize, and you can see from where that is in the book, there's so much before it. But then they play the games, they play a number of games, and then you have kind of the aftermath. So maybe you could just kind of round out the story for us, even though most of us think of that as the story. I really think it's this whole context you've given us that makes it so much more than it was.
Right. And so their first game for the unified team was the next day. They played Sweden, and that was a really surreal atmosphere just because you had President Moon was in attendance, Kim Yo-jong was there, other North Korean officials, and then you also had the North Korean cheerleading troops. So you had 200 North Korean cheerleaders, which drew the attention that both the cheerleaders and the politicians made it into a spectacle, in a sense. It was like a circus atmosphere, and all the attention was focused on the people in the stands, it seemed, and not the people on the ice. The goaltender Shin So-jung had always told me she always dreamed and waited for the moment when her name would be announced, in the starting lineup as an Olympian. And I remember as they were announcing the starting lineups and they're about to call So-jung's name, that's when President Moon walked in. And so all the journalists, everyone rushes over to take photos of President Moon, and no one's paying attention to So-jung on the ice. And that atmosphere really affected the team, I think. They lost their first game 8-0. And then their next game against Sweden, they also lost 8-0. And everyone was so frustrated. Players, the South Koreans, were even more upset at this idea of the unified team. And there was almost some fracturing in a way kind of happening. The next game, though, was against Japan. And so South Korea had always seen the game against Japan as the one game of the Olympics that they were determined to win. And a lot of that has to do with historical reasons and just the natural rivalry between the two nations. But also Japan was the team most similar to South Korea in skill level. They both were smaller teams who focused on speed. Playing Sweden and Switzerland, South Korea was going up against players who on average were 3-4 inches taller, 30 pounds heavier than they were. South Korea was by far the smallest team in the Olympic Games, but they matched up, at least physically, well against Japan. The game started out sluggishly. Korea fell behind 2-0, and it almost felt, here we go again, they're on their way to another defeat. Eventually, though, South Korea scored a goal in the second period, the first goal of the Olympics, which was scored by Randy Griffin, one of the import players, which really ignited the arena, the players on the team, and so for the next 20 minutes or so, they played probably their best hockey in the Olympics. Japan added a few late goals and did end up winning the game, but it felt like the focus was on the team again. And so one of the things that happened after that game was the players would come up to the concourse of the arena and meet their family. And so after the first two games, there was nothing but crying and teary eyes. And they're so upset about losing those first two games 8-0. And then when that kind of display was happening after the Japan game, there was a different atmosphere. And one of the reasons why was it was not just their parents this time. There were hundreds of Korean fans there who had been at the game, who were waiting to meet the women's hockey players, to take pictures with them, to get their autographs, and they were finally recognizing them for being hockey players in a sense, and they appreciated what they had done in terms of representing their country. And so it took away a lot of the politicized aspect. And even though South Korea went on, the Korean team didn't win any games in the Olympics. After that, the appreciation and the way they played, it was more focused on them as a team as opposed to everything else that kind of surrounded and clouded the unified team's existence leading up to that.
I loved your vignette about, and I remember seeing this a little bit watching some of the Olympics on TV, of how the North Korean cheerleaders, who were very, one might say robotic, and stylized, really got into the hockey, and kind of became hockey fans too, or maybe this, and that was a very special thing. Well, I want to ask you, I'm not going to ask you what the future of, North Korea policy is or diplomacy, but what's the future of ice hockey, women's ice hockey in South Korea, and some observations about sports diplomacy, if you like. I mean, and I think you see the evolution of the players. I wonder how they feel about it now. But even more, you followed this for so long, and when you started the story, you didn't know it was going to turn to this direction, right? To the North Korea direction.
Right.
But what's your sense about the idea of unified teams and using sports as a way of building bridges and pursuing diplomacy?
So after the Olympics, there has been a small bump in interest in hockey in Korea. You do see more younger players getting involved. Kiha, the Korea Ice Hockey Association, they actually created their first junior national team or under 18 team after the Olympics, and that team still in 2019, so in this past January, they won their World Championship tournament. So you do have a core of what it seems, younger players who are getting involved. Some of the older players on the team did retire after the Olympics. All the import players came back to the US or Canada to kind of continue on their lives here. In terms of sports diplomacy, that's a really interesting and good question. After the Olympics, when I saw the players again and kind of did final interviews with them, I would ask them, like, what do you make of things that have happened and the role your team did play in this kind of broader or bigger aspect? And none of the players, I think, wanted to take credit for anything that happened politically or diplomatically, but I think it evolved to a point where they started to understand that they were a part of something that was a bit bigger than sport. Me personally, it's hard to get caught up in the fluff that surrounds the Olympic Games and a lot of big international sporting events, where obviously there is this very heavy message of peace and harmony that is projected out there. Just knowing how Olympic Games are formed in the past with bribes and the billions of dollars that are spent to host games and such. But there is something that I do feel that people gather from events like the Olympics, where there is, whether it's symbolism or inspiration or just nationalism that people get watching the Olympics. And I definitely do think viewers not only in Korea but around the world got that from watching this unified team. I know that they have made other unified teams in other sports between the two Koreas after the Olympics. There are talks about having them for 2020, the Tokyo Games, and even a joint bid to host the 2032 Olympics in North and South Korea. We're definitely, I feel, a long way off from anything like that happening, but it's sports diplomacy is a very tricky kind of topic in a way. I mean, I don't think you've ever seen athletes like obviously manifesting their displeasure with it or coming out with it. So it does give the message that you want, but I also don't feel like sports diplomacy or the idea of unified teams can cure everything.
Mm-hmm.
There's actual, dirty work that needs to
Yeah,
be
no, I
done.
think there are a lot of insights there, and certainly what came to me very strongly reading this and thinking about it is I mean, what a huge kind of burden was put on these young women who had devoted their whole lives to playing a sport that's not particularly popular in South Korea, and to be 14 or 15 years old. And I mean, your story about how they were very upset that they were not going to be able to wear the South Korean flag, because the whole notion, I think it's just true. I mean, regardless of one's political views, you're going to wear your flag and go to the Olympics. And then, like 2 weeks before the Olympics, they said, no, take that off. It's not going to be the Taikoki. Here's a new uniform for you. I think that must have been incredibly confusing to them.
Yeah.
But as you say, they kind of have thought this through, and clearly it's going to affect, I think, their attitudes as citizens, if you like, as well as athletes going forward. So it was really fascinating. I'm going to turn to Young to kind of lead the question answer, but thank you so much for this, and thanks for answering all my questions.
Yes, so we'll start our question and answers, and perhaps while the guests are thinking about a question, maybe I can start, take the prerogative and ask the first question, which is, you said that this began as kind of an article piece for the New York Times. Was there a particular moment where you realized, my gosh, this has to be a book?
Not initially, but when I first met the full team in January 2017 in Minnesota for one of their training camps, and right away I could tell that there was just something different about the dynamic, the chemistry within the team, not only from their age composition and the different backgrounds, but I was really drawn into their camaraderie. You mentioned the flags on the uniforms, and I remember seeing, they all wore these matching tracksuits with the South Korean flag, and it was on their backpacks. And even just for me personally, that was something very resonant to me. Like that created feelings even inside me, seeing that, and then seeing these 24, 25 women wearing that flag so proudly. But when I did get to learn about their backgrounds and stories, I think even back then in January, I knew that I don't think I was thinking in terms of, oh, this will be a book, but I knew that there was more to tell about the story. And so I became very invested in trying to just learn as much as I could about them and pick up whatever I could to whatever in any way, maybe whether it was doing a follow-up story or a series of stories. I just knew that the material was so rich and that there was so much more to be told than could be encapsulated in just one story.
So, is there a mic? Okay, there is. Can we start with? There's a mic coming.
Hi, Lisa Delphi-Narati, a professor of sports management at George Washington University, and Pyeongchang were my 19th consecutive Olympic Games, and some of my students joined me at those games, and we were able to witness the cheerleaders and the hockey team. It was quite exciting, but your story is amazing. And in your follow-up, were you able to talk to the North Korean players as well?
So I was not able to. One of the things about covering the Olympic Games, even as a journalist, to get a media credential for the Olympics, you have to apply like 2.5, 3 years before the games. And so I only knew I was writing this book about a year before, so it was too late to get media access. But even then, I found out that they didn't really make the North Korean players available to the media, and so it was very hard just to get any kind of access to them. So all the anecdotes, all the stories, information was provided by the South Korean players, their kind of first-hand accounts of their interactions with the North Koreans.
Feathers, but I'll let them.
Other questions? Yes, please.
We'll get back to you again.
This is quite fascinating. I was wondering, when you interviewed or observed the South Korean players, did you speak Korean? Did you have an interpreter? Did you find yourself changing?
Yeah, so I don't speak Korean, and one of the things I learned was that the younger players, the teenage girls on the team. So they all take English classes in school, and they were a lot of them were good. They would other players told me, oh yes, they get straight A's in English. They're pretty fluent, but they were very shy in speaking English. They didn't think that they were good in it. So I remember the first kind of conversations I would have with them, I would ask these long, drawn-out, very elaborate questions, and they would just respond or say yes and shake their head, and that was it. So when I learned that they were very shy in speaking it, I changed my approach in a way. I would try to keep my interactions with them more so casual, answer just very basic short questions to just drum up casual conversation with them. And then after the Olympics, I did go back to Korea, and I hired a fixer translator. And then with her, I was able to have more detailed 4 or 5 hour conversations with the players to get those kind of more richly colorful answers that I had been hoping for. So. Oh, and for me, yeah, so I still can't speak Korean or don't speak Korean, but it definitely was a bit of a change for me. I felt very much like a lot of the import players in terms of just my own background and connection to Korea. So I was adopted and raised here, and I didn't really grow up in any kind of Korean American community. I didn't even know that Korean American groups or culture camps or things like that existed growing up, and so it was very distant. Obviously, I knew that I was Korean, but that connection wasn't there. But definitely over time and following this team and spending time around this team, the way I describe it in the book, when I saw the players wearing their track jackets with the flags on it for the first time, it was like this patriotism just came out of hibernation for me. And so I do feel a much stronger connection. There are aspects where I still don't feel very Korean. Like I could be in situations with talking to people from organizations or at functions, and obviously there are aspects about Korean culture or history that I'm just not familiar with, and so in those moments I maybe feel not as strongly Korean, but it doesn't bother me, I would say, and I still feel like it's very much an evolving process for me in terms of my own personal feelings to, my Koreanness or what it means to be Korean, but definitely more so stronger after this experience with the book.
Hi, thank you very much. I'm John Fay with the Mansfield Foundation. To what extent has the inspiration of the women's hockey team in the Olympics inspired or catalyzed any kind of movement or awareness in Korea of women who want to step out of their traditional gender roles and do quote-unquote non-traditional things?
Right. So as Kathleen was touching on earlier, the role of not only women's ice hockey players but female athletes in Korea, a lot of it seems is, so unless you're someone like Kim Yoo-na, you don't get kind of that attention, that money, that adulation in terms of professional sports in South Korea, women's athletes in general, unless you're a world champion LPGA golfer, someone of that status. You're not known, you're not kind of covered. A lot of it, in a way, kind of parallels the way women's sports are treated in this country here. When you look at the WNBA or women's hockey players or women's soccer players and what they're given compared to male athletes. But after the games, the women's hockey players were very outspoken and very forward in kind of wanting not to be forgotten, but they also knew that they had sacrificed something within this, and they didn't want, people to forget about it. And so they were very open in kind of pushing for women's hockey to continue to grow, to demand more resources, and they became actually very vocal about that. And it was something that they went to, even the media in South Korea picked up on, and you saw shortly after the Olympic Games, not only the women's hockey players kind of took these stands and were more open in discussing their situations and the predicaments that they were in, but the curling team from the Olympics, which a lot of people remember, who won silver from South Korea, they did the same thing. They spoke out about inequities that they had faced, monies that were withheld for them, mistreatment or abuse that they had suffered from higher ups, and they held a big press conference where they basically let these things known. And you've seen other athletes such as speed skaters talk about abuse, sexual abuse that they faced by coaches, and finally coming forward and being able to speak openly about that. So it has been very interesting to see more female athletes in South Korea kind of take these more, progressive stands and just being more open and talking about, the inequities that they do face. I think a problem is a lot of people in power, or the people that kind of make important decisions, still maybe turn a deaf ear to it, but it is important for those athletes to just continue to speak up and be more open and letting it be known and putting their voice out there.
Thank you. And this is a follow-up. When the import players came in, who was coaching? Was it that Canadian American?
It was Sarah. So Sarah became the coach around 2014, 2015, and she was an import technically herself with the import players.
I was just curious. There's a study out there right now about abusive coaching techniques, and when in some cultures that's not abusive and some is not. And so I would have been interested to find out when those import players came in, if it was a Korean coach.
Oh, yeah.
They have a complete different way
Right.
of doing things than, say, an American or Canadian coach. So
Right.
I was just curious. Second question, did players the South Korean players who did not make the team, was there only one or was there others that were bumped?
I mean, in the years leading up to the Olympics, there were players that quit or just kind of knew that they weren't on the level as the other players on the team. But when it came down to the final roster that was training up into the Olympics, it was one South Korean player who was left off.
Because that was a question that many people were asking, is how many South Korean players were bumped from the team to bring in the North, but you're saying it was really only one.
Right.
And did that person get any honorary, like, clothing from the games, or did we compensate this person in any way at all?
So she was actually hired by SBS, I believe, to be it was SBS or KBS, to be a commentator for all the ice hockey games at the Olympics. So she went right into the broadcast booth, yeah.
And do you know to the South Korean players ever were able to communicate with the North Koreans on a continual basis?
They haven't spoke to them since the Olympics. The one thing that did happen was, so it was SBS she worked for, and then I have a friend who's a reporter for KBS. And so after the Olympics, there was World Championship tournaments held, which are held every year, and they're broken down into skill levels. So North Korea and South Korea play in different groups, but this reporter from KBS went to the tournament that North Korea was at, and before she went, she had the South Korean players kind of record video messages, and so she played them for the North Koreans when she saw them later on. But other than that, there's been no direct communication between the two sides.
How did the North Korea state media cover this event? Did they use this event as a kind of story that invoke the sense of national identity and national pride, or otherwise?
That's a good question. The few kind of dispatches or things that I read were from like South Korean English language outlets who would consume what was coming out of North Korea, and it seemed all the dispatches coming from North Korea were just solely focused on the North Korean athletes, not mentioning the imports for the South Korean players or even the results of the games, just saying, how the North Korean athletes were performing strongly in the Olympics and representing the country kind of thing.
Hi, Paulo from the State Department. Remember in the U.S. hockey team story, Miracle, there's that poignant moment when they're asked, "Who do you play for?" And were there any other moments like that after the torch, besides the game against Japan?
Yeah.
And the second question I'd have is are the South Koreans looking for import players going forward in other sports, soccer, for example?
Start with your second question. I don't know about other sports. I do know that there are a couple players, for example, like on the junior team, that are training there in South Korea that are from the U.S. So there still seem to be maybe trying to keep that pipeline of finding Korean Americans or so. I don't think it's on the level of it was for the Olympics, but I do know of one player, at least in particular. She's 13, 14, and she's been in South Korea training for the upcoming Under-18 World Championships. In terms of kind of that inspirational moment, there is one it's more so funny story that I'll share. It might not be funny to some people, but the way the South Koreans received it was. So before the game against Japan, the locker room is very down. They've lost these 2 games in a row, 8-0, and that sense of camaraderie isn't there. And so just minutes before the team takes the ice, Coach Pak, who's the North Korean coach who was assigned to the unified team, he had always been very seemed blasé. He didn't really see anything, just kind of sat in the corner, it seemed like, from everything the players were telling me. And then, so the team's about to head onto the ice, and so Coach Pak stands up, and he starts giving this impassioned speech, and all the South Koreans are taken aback. And eventually, he's like ranting and just yelling almost, and he actually uses a word that disparages the Japanese players. He uses a disparaging term for them, and all the South Koreans just start laughing because they never expected to hear him say anything like this. And so when they take the ice before the Japan game, the mood is lightened a bit. Like, there isn't that just tension and that feeling of, woe is me. They're just laughing because Coach Pak just gave this, impassioned speech out of nowhere. So
Hi. As you mentioned, that North Korean and South Korean, when they practiced, they will speak in 2 different hockey language terms.
Mm-hmm.
So at the game, do they resolve their issues, or maybe there's some possibility clicked?
They did try to, so not only did they create the dictionary, but the South Korean players also tried to simplify terms, specifically. So, for example, a power play in hockey is when it's 5 players on the ice against 4 because someone has committed a penalty. So a South Korean player would just kind of simplify it for a North Korean player, saying, oh, we're going to practice 5-on-4 now, or just raise their hands so they could very quickly understand, okay, we're going to do power play drills now. You could definitely see, though, the breakdown in terms of the North Korean players not being fully acclimated, just observing, watching them play. There were times when I would see North Korean players drifting out of position, almost colliding into South Korean players, just because they were on the wrong spots on the ice. And so, and one other interesting thing about communication that they told me was not so much the North Korean players speaking a different language, but when the cheerleaders were there, it was hard for a lot of the South Korean players to focus. 1, because the cheerleaders were so loud, and 2, it was just hard not to notice them. And then, they would be in a game and they would be losing 4-0, and you're hearing all these cheerleaders chant, like, cheer up, do your best, and the players are just thinking, like, shut up, essentially, kind of. That's not what they want to hear at that point, and so that was one kind of communication problem, I think, that they encountered early on.
Perhaps I'll take the host prerogative and ask the final question, which is, who did you have in mind when you wrote this book? Is there a particular person or a community that you had in mind as you embarked on this project?
It's a good question. I think one of the things there were 2 points I always try to keep in the back of my mind as I was writing this. One was, when the North Korean news happened, I automatically knew that this becomes a huge part of the story, but I didn't want it to overtake the story. I always wanted the focus to be on the South Korean team, meaning the South Korean players and the imports. That's what the book was going to be about originally, and so even though when it became the unified team, I didn't want to lose focus and just make it a North Korea, South Korea story. And then also, in terms of an audience for this book, I knew it was going to be a hard sell. You're writing a book about women's hockey, but not only women's hockey in South Korea. And so that's why the themes about kind of identity and family, I try to play up very much throughout the book, because I think a lot of the things that the players experience and go through are very much universal. And, the search for belonging that I think everyone goes on in a way, trying to find your place in this world. And that's very much what I feel the characters in this book experience throughout.
Well, perfect. Well, Seth, thank you for writing the book and this wonderful discussion. Ambassador Stephens, thank you so much for your discussion. And thank you all for joining us today. The book is now available. It is on sale everywhere there's good books are sold. So please go check it out, and hope you'll join me in giving Seth a round of applause.